Can a family inherit a debt in blood? Can the unforgivable sins of ancestors echo through generations, demanding a horrifying payment long after the perpetrators are turned to dust? These are not mere philosophical musings. They are questions most of humanity dismisses as grim folklore, the sensational stuff of campfire tales and Gothic novels, designed solely to send a manufactured shiver down the spine. But for one lineage, deep within the forgotten, sun-baked heart of rural Georgia, these are not questions to be debated in academic halls. For them, these are chilling certainties, an undeniable, suffocating reality. They are the Johnsons of Ravenwood, and their story is not a quaint local legend. It is a meticulously documented chronicle of unrelenting terror, a harrowing testament to a malevolent force, a horror that refuses to die. Our journey takes us to Ravenwood, Georgia, a place barely a dot on any modern map, yet a vortex of unspoken grief and undeniable historical atrocity. Here, the humid air itself seems heavy, thick with the weight of centuries, each breath a struggle against the oppressive past. The distant, incessant cry of cicadas sounds less like the natural hum of summer and more like a collective, tortured sigh from innumerable restless graves. Skeletal remains of an old cotton gin, its timbers weathered to a ghostly gray, stand sentinel over fields now overgrown with kudzu, a verdant shroud attempting to bury secrets that stubbornly refuse to lie quiet. This land remembers. It remembers the sweat and torment of enslaved labor, the screams of violent betrayal, the brutal acts of usurpation. Ravenwood isn't merely a location on a map. It is a repository of agony, a sentient entity whose soil has absorbed and held onto every drop of spilled blood. It is a place where the past isn't merely buried. It's simply waiting, a coiled serpent ready to strike again. For generations, the Johnson family has lived a life outwardly unremarkable, striving for the mundane normalcy of small-town America. Yet internally, they are fractured beyond repair. Their peace has always been a fragile, gossamer illusion, built precariously atop a foundation of inherited fear, a terror too deeply ingrained to ever truly articulate. They are prisoners, not confined by physical walls, but shackled by a shared genetic memory, an ironclad curse passed down through their very bloodline. A curse stemming directly from a series of brutal acts, the violent seizure of indigenous land and the subsequent cold-blooded murder of its rightful inhabitants in the late 1800s. This is their terrestrial inheritance, a debt demanding payment in human lives, connected inextricably to the very soil their ancestors violently claimed and the innocent souls they so grievously wronged. Each new death within their lineage, each unspeakable tragedy, has renewed the chilling understanding that this isn't a quaint local superstition. It is an active, ravenous entity, patiently waiting its turn to collect its horrific due. The fragile peace of the current generation was utterly shattered just weeks ago, coinciding with a rare, spectacular meteor shower, an event eerily similar to the original celestial phenomenon of 1975, the one locally dubbed the Rain of Fire. The family's youngest member, a vibrant, innocent spirit, vanished without a trace into the shadowed woods surrounding their ancestral home. Days later, their small, mutilated body was discovered, bearing grotesque hallmarks chillingly identical to the victims from the original wave of deaths nearly 5 decades prior. The terror was not a stranger. It had simply found a new face to wear, a new life to claim. This time, however, the sheer, unbearable weight of desperation finally outweighed their deeply ingrained code of silence, a silence born of generations of fear and quiet suffering. The surviving Johnsons, their faces etched with a silent agony that spoke volumes, finally reached out. They found us, the Hidden Horror Team, Their impossible, horrifying reality compelled them to document their truth, to expose a nightmare that defies all logic, all science, and mocks the very laws of nature. They understood, with a bone-deep certainty, that if they did not act, if they did not lay bare the secrets of Ravenwood, the curse would surely consume them all, leaving their bloodline utterly extinguished. We have now begun an exhaustive, meticulous investigation, sifting through generations of dusty family records, poring over local historical archives, and re-examining forgotten, suppressed police reports from multiple counties. Our goal is clear, yet daunting: to unearth the true nature of that sinister 19th-century pact, to understand its ancient, gruesome rules, and to find, if it even exists, a way to break it before the Reign of Fire claims its next, inevitable victim. The Johnson struggle is a desperate, agonizing race against an inevitable legacy, a conflict not against conventional, external monsters, but against the very essence of their lineage and the terrible, inescapable price of their ancestors' unspeakable transgressions. Our narrative will unfold with a dark, melancholic urgency, an investigative journey into a historical tragedy excavated piece by agonizing piece. The language will remain somber, reflecting the oppressive weight of the Johnsons' past and the relentless, active force of a curse woven into the very fabric of forgotten American history. It evokes a chilling, inescapable sense that the land itself remembers, that the tormented, forgotten dead demand justice, regardless of the horrifying cost to the living descendants. We are searching for answers in a place where the air itself seems to whisper names from graves long forgotten, where the soil holds secrets that refuse to stay buried, and where the past is a living, breathing predator. This is the story of the Johnsons of Ravenwood, and the unspeakable horror that has clung to their bloodline since the first celestial reign of fire scarred the land. We are attempting to understand what truly drives a curse to manifest with such terrifying precision across generations, and whether the living can truly escape a debt that history and blood refuses to forget. The investigation into the baffling generational deaths plaguing the Johnson lineage demanded more than the hidden horror team's raw passion for uncovering forgotten atrocities. It required a bridge, a translator between the whispered terrors of a seemingly cursed bloodline and the stark, unforgiving truths of the observable world. This crucial link was forged with Dr. Eris Thorne, a name synonymous with rigorous debunking and an unwavering commitment to empirical data. A distinguished professor of sociocultural anthropology at Oak Haven University, Dr. Thorne had cultivated a formidable reputation for meticulously dismantling cultural myths, never for validating them. His intellect was as sharp as any surgical blade, his professional skepticism honed by decades immersed in the complex interplay of rural folklore, deeply embedded historical trauma, and the often unseen currents of community psychology. His extensive body of work, frequently gracing the pages of esteemed peer-reviewed journals, consistently sought to unearth the tangible, empirical roots beneath even the most entrenched fantastical narratives. He held a particular fascination for cases where mass hysteria, deeply ingrained ancestral beliefs, or regional isolation transformed isolated tragedies into seemingly supernatural phenomena. Dr. Thorne considered himself a cultural scientist, not a purveyor of the paranormal. He approached phenomena like the Johnson family's claims with a methodical detachment that bordered on clinical. To him, the stories of curses and spectral retribution were rich tapestries of human belief, compelling for their sociological implications, but never literal manifestations of malevolent forces. His initial engagement with the Ravenwood case was purely academic, driven by intellectual curiosity rather than a belief in the improbable. He saw a unique, if morbid, opportunity to study the psychological evolution of a multi-generational narrative of victimhood and the societal construction of a so-called curse. To him, the Rain of Fire was a dramatic, celestial event, misremembered, embellished, or opportunistically repurposed to explain a series of unfortunate, albeit undeniably tragic, occurrences. He was convinced that the true horror lay not in the supernatural, but in the depths of human credulity and the self-perpetuating nature of fear. He arrived at the Ravenwood site not with divining rods or antiquated EMF meters, tools he openly disdained, but with the pragmatic essentials of a forensic anthropologist: sterile sampling kits, a geological survey compass, a precise soil analysis sampler, and a meticulously organized checklist of historical records to cross-reference against contemporary events. His methodology was unwavering, rooted firmly in the tenets of the scientific method. Every piece of information, every frantic family account, every chilling local legend was subjected to relentless, rigorous scrutiny. He began by immediately demanding unimpeded access to all extant death certificates, original autopsy reports, and police records pertaining to the Johnson family deaths, not just from 1975, but meticulously tracing the lineage back through generations. He sought quantifiable data above all else: precise causes of death, exact dates, meticulously documented environmental factors, and comprehensive medical histories for each victim, searching for patterns that could only emerge from the concrete. His initial working hypothesis was unambiguous and thoroughly grounded in reason. The cumulative deaths, while undeniably tragic and statistically unusual, were almost certainly explainable through a combination of heretofore undetected environmental toxins, undiagnosed genetic conditions passed down through the bloodline, or perhaps even a long-running, skillfully concealed criminal conspiracy that had preyed on the family for decades. The notion of a land-based curse, a spectral debt demanding payment in human lives, was to him nothing more than a pre-scientific interpretation, a primitive explanation for complex socio-economic. Thorne systematically requested comprehensive geological surveys of the Ravenwood land, looking for natural gas pockets, insidious radon emissions, or unusual mineral deposits that could account for sudden illness, inexplicable disorientation, or strange localized phenomena often attributed to spectral activity. He insisted on interviewing each surviving Johnson family member individually, employing structured psychological assessments designed to gauge their current mental state, their susceptibility to suggestion, and the internal cohesiveness of their terrifying shared narrative. His objective was to methodically identify inconsistencies, illogical leaps, or any telltale signs of mass hysteria that might have propagated the curse narrative. He also rigorously sought out granular local meteorological data for 1975 and subsequent years, searching for anomalous weather patterns, unusual atmospheric conditions, or any documented incidents of strange, non-celestial phenomena reported co. He postulated that the meteor shower, while visually striking and emotionally impactful, could have merely coincided with something far more terrestrial, something easily overlooked by a rural population already predisposed to mystical thinking and prone to conflating unrelated events. He conducted careful, almost forensic examinations of the entire Ravenwood property itself. He painstakingly mapped out the precise locations where each body was discovered, analyzing soil samples from those spots for unusual compositional anomalies or trace contaminants. He even took core samples from the aging timbers of the skeletal cotton. He wasn't looking for ghosts. He was searching for facts, for patterns that could be charted, for causes that could be scientifically validated and replicated. He believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had built a career on proof that every mystery possessed a rational, explainable solution. The Johnsons' desperate plight, however dire and emotionally charged it seemed, was no exception. He viewed this entire engagement as a compelling case study in human credulity, a morbid fascination that had unfortunately taken a devastating hold of a vulnerable, isolated family. He was there, he felt, to provide a definitive, scientific debunking, to offer the Johnsons closure through the cold, clear light of logic, and ultimately, to rescue these individuals from the suffocating grip of a self-fulfilling prophecy. His calm, academic voice, devoid of any emotional inflection, was a stark, almost unnerving contrast to the abject terror that had consumed the Johnsons for generations. A meticulously crafted beacon of reason in a narrative steeped entirely in the inexplicable. He fully expected to leave Ravenwood with a meticulously footnoted academic paper, not a chilling, unanswerable question that would shake the very foundations of his rational world. Our journey to Ravenwood was an immersion into a landscape that felt less like a place and more like a wound. The asphalt roads, once smooth, surrendered to cracked, overgrown pathways, swallowed by the voracious kudzu that seemed to breathe, slow and green, across the forgotten corners of rural Georgia. The air grew thick, not just with humidity, but with a palpable stillness, an oppressive silence broken only by the incessant thrum of cicadas, a sound that, here, resonated less with summer and more with a collective lament. This was not a drive, it was a descent. The Johnson property itself offered little reprieve. A sprawling, weathered farmhouse stood hunched amidst a tangle of ancient, gnarled oaks, their branches weeping Spanish moss like old men mourning. The distant silhouette of the old cotton gin, skeletal against the bruised sky, solidified the sense of history not merely etched into the land, but actively seeping from it. Our initial assessment confirmed the premise. Ravenwood was steeped in an ancestry of suffering. We found the Johnsons not in a state of hysteria, but of weary, almost resigned despair. Martha Johnson, the matriarch, a woman whose eyes held the weight of generations of grief, greeted us with a somber hospitality that spoke volumes. Her sons, Thomas and Daniel, stood silent behind her, their faces etched with a profound weariness, their movements deliberate, as if each step required immense effort against an unseen burden. Their silence was more eloquent than any screams. It was the silence of people living under a perpetual shadow, accustomed to the slow, errorless, agonizing drip of inevitable sorrow. Gaining their trust was less about convincing them of our sincerity and more about navigating the deep-seated fatalism that had become their inherited shield. They had lived with this terror, this family shame, for so long that articulating it to outsiders felt almost like a betrayal of the very silence that had, paradoxically, offered a semblance of protection. We were not merely documentarians. We were unwelcome witnesses, forcing them to peel back layers of generational trauma. The recent death of young Lily Johnson, a child barely 7 years old, had finally fractured their stoicism. Her disappearance, coinciding precisely with the rare Perseid meteor shower, a chilling echo of the celestial event of 1975 that local folklore had branded the Rain of Fire, had been the final, unbearable catalyst. Martha described the discovery of Lily's body with a chilling detachment that masked immeasurable pain. The disfigurement, the specific ritualistic mutilations, were identical, she claimed, to those of her own brother, claimed by the curse back in 1975, a pattern precisely replicated, spanning nearly 50 years. Our initial walkthrough of the property revealed little in the way of conventional evidence. No forced entry, no struggle, nothing to suggest a human perpetrator. The Johnsons themselves had long ceased to look for one. Their belief in the curse was not born of superstition, but of repeated, undeniable, and horrific experience. It was a lived reality, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of their everyday lives. Thomas, the eldest son, eventually led us to an old, leather-bound journal, brittle with age, its pages filled with faded, looping script. "Grandpa Elias's ramblings," he murmured, his voice strained. He tried to make sense of it. Before it took him to. This journal, we quickly realized, was the key to unlocking the deepest chambers of the Johnson family's torment. It spoke not of a natural disaster or a random act of violence, but of a specific, deliberate act of transgression that had initiated this generation's long horror. Elias Johnson, a man consumed by the family's dark legacy, had attempted to chart the impossible. His entries detailed not only the recurring dates and the specific brutalizations, but also hinted at a pact, a desperate bargain made in the late 1800s, a debt paid in blood for lands seized and lives extinguished. The weight of these revelations settled heavily upon us. Our cameras, our microphones, our scientific instruments felt woefully inadequate against the ancient, malevolent force that seemed to permeate the very soil of Ravenwood. We had come seeking a story. We found ourselves confronted by a living nightmare, a historical wound that refused to heal. The Johnsons were not merely victims. They were the unfortunate inheritors of a cosmic debt, a lineage marked by an entity that demanded ongoing payment. As dusk bled into night, transforming the kudzu-choked landscape into something truly alien, we understood the Johnsons' terror. The silence of the house, of the land, was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. We had made contact, and in doing so, we had stepped into the chilling, undeniable reality of the Ravenwood curse. A horror deeply rooted in the violent, forgotten corners of American history. The investigation had begun, but the true nature of this terrifying force, its rules and its origins, remained shrouded in shadow, waiting to be unearthed. And we knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that the deeper we dug, the closer we would come to understanding the terrible price of their ancestors' sins, and perhaps the price of our own intrusion. The rain of fire had left its mark. The long drive into Ravenwood felt less like travel and more like an unwelcome descent into a forgotten pocket of the world. The asphalt narrowed, cracked, giving way to gravel, and then simply dirt, swallowed by the relentless, verdant siege of kudzu. This wasn't merely a place on a map. It was a geography of isolation, a territory stubbornly resistant to the march of time, where the humid air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken history. As the vehicle crunched to a halt before the Johnson property, the profound silence that followed was not peaceful, but heavy, expectant, broken only by the distant, mournful call of a lone crow and the faint, persistent buzz of unseen insects. The Johnson home, a sprawling, weather-beaten farmhouse, sat low under the gnarled embrace of ancient oaks, its windows like vacant, knowing eyes. It exuded a palpable aura of profound exhaustion, of bearing witness to centuries of sorrow and unspeakable acts. Inside, the air was cool, almost unnaturally so for a Georgia summer, carrying a faint, cloying scent that clung to the throat. A mix of damp earth, decaying timber, and something indefinably metallic. Our initial setup was methodical. Environmental sensors deployed to meticulously monitor temperature, humidity, and subtle shifts in electromagnetic fields. High-definition cameras and sensitive audio recorders, calibrated to pick up the slightest acoustic anomaly, were discreetly placed in every room the family permitted access to. We approached the Johnsons' claims with the dispassionate rigor of any academic study, Yet the very act of deploying our sophisticated equipment felt less like scientific inquiry and more like an unwelcome intrusion, a deliberate prodding of something ancient and best left undisturbed. The first anomalies were insidious, almost dismissible, easily attributed to an aging house or rural power grid. But their persistence and peculiar nature soon defied such simple explanations. Batteries, fresh from their sealed packaging, would drain with alarming speed, sometimes completely within hours, rendering essential recording devices useless at critical moments. Our thermal cameras, calibrated for scientific accuracy, registered inexplicable localized cold spots that drifted through rooms, pockets of air several degrees below ambient temperature. These cold zones moved without discernible drafts, often seeming to linger near personal objects or photographs, creating unsettling visual distortions on our screens. The electrical wiring in the house, despite recent professional inspection, seemed to possess a malevolent will of its own. Lights flickered erratically, sometimes dimming to a faint, sickly glow before surging back to full intensity, often when no one was near the switches or even in the room. It was a subtle, almost playful subversion of the predictable, a constant, frustrating disruption of our attempts at objective data collection. Then came the sounds, the auditory intrusions that chipped away at our resolve. Faint, distant scraping noises would emanate from within the walls, like something attempting to claw its way free from within the very structure of the house. Soft, melancholic hums that seemed to resonate from the very floorboards beneath our feet. One evening, a member of our audio team, a man of unwavering skepticism with decades of experience debunking false positives, reported capturing what he described as unmistakable guttural breathing on a recorder placed in the empty master bedroom, a room the Johnsons themselves avoided with an almost superstitious dread. The noise was faint, almost subliminal, but undeniably present on the playback, distorted and chilling, overlaid with what sounded like muffled, whispered speech that defied translation and analysis. It was not human, not animal. It was something else. The psychological impact began to manifest subtly but pervasively across the team. Seasoned professionals, accustomed to confronting the inexplicable without flinching, found themselves struggling with profound, inexplicable fatigue. Despite adequate rest, sleep became a battleground for vivid, unsettling dreams that always featured the same recurring motifs: cold, grasping hands reaching from darkness, a pervasive smell of damp earth and decay, and the inescapable sensation of being watched from unseen vantage points within the shadows. The Johnsons themselves seemed to exist in a permanent state of low-grade terror, their eyes darting, their voices perpetually hushed, as if any sudden movement or raised tone might awaken something terrible, something that was perpetually listening. They spoke of the curse not as a historical anecdote, a cautionary tale from the past, but as a living, breathing entity that occupied the periphery of their lives, always waiting, always demanding, always moving just beyond the veil of normal perception. As our equipment continued to malfunction and the bizarre occurrences intensified, the initial veneer of scientific detachment began to fray. The meticulously collected data, cross-referenced and analyzed with every available tool, presented a consistent, disturbing narrative of unexplained phenomena that defied conventional physics and logic. A standard magnetic compass, when brought into the house's musty attic, would spin wildly, pointing in arbitrary directions before settling on true north only when removed from the property. A glass of water, left unattended on a kitchen counter, would sometimes be found half-emptied, with no one having been near it, no spills, no logical explanation for the missing volume. These were not the sensational, cinematic displays of supernatural horror often depicted in fiction, but rather a persistent, unnerving erosion of reality, a quiet, methodical dismantling of reason, designed to induce a slow, creeping madness. The sheer cumulative weight of these anomalies began to press upon us, creating an atmosphere of palpable, oppressive dread. The Johnsons' ancestral home was not merely a house, it was a crucible, a focal point for an active, malevolent energy that seemed to resent our very presence, our attempt to categorize and understand it. It was as if the land itself, saturated with the echoes of ancient injustice and violent betrayal, was waking, stirring from a long, restless slumber, and beginning to reveal the true, horrifying extent of the debt it demanded. Our investigation had ceased to be a detached observation. It had become an interaction, a slow, deliberate engagement with a force that had remained dormant, or perhaps merely unseen, for generations. We had arrived, seeking answers, and Ravenwood was indeed beginning to provide them. But the language it spoke was one of escalating unease, of growing disruption, signaling that our presence had indeed agitated the very core of the Johnsons' inherited nightmare. The true nature of their suffering, long whispered and hidden, was now undeniably and terrifyingly beginning to reveal itself. The Hidden Horror Team, accustomed to the frustrating labyrinth of historical research, found Ravenwood a particularly resistant puzzle. Its official records were sparse, ravaged by time and neglect, seemingly designed to obscure rather than reveal the true depths of its past. The Johnsons themselves, burdened by generations of unspoken terror, offered only fragmented whispers, a legacy of fear passed down through hushed tones and evasive silences. A family history deliberately shrouded in an almost pathological denial. Yet, somewhere within the dusty archives of the county seat and amidst the Johnsons' own ancestral belongings, lay the threads of a narrative so appalling it had been intentionally buried beneath layers of self-serving myth and willful forgetting. The meticulous work of sifting through brittle documents, of cross-referencing obscure land surveys with forgotten probate records, was akin to archaeology, each discovery unearthing not just facts, but a palpable sense of dread. The breakthrough came not in a grand revelation, but in a series of painstakingly pieced-together fragments, each one a chilling whisper from a brutalized past. Old land deeds, brittle and yellowed with age, hinted at unusual and often aggressive transactions in the late 1870s, discrepancies in property lines, abrupt transfers of significant acreage, and a series of hastily filed legal documents suggested a disturbing pattern of calculated acquisition by the burgeoning Johnson patriarch, one Thaddeus Johnson. This was not merely shrewd business. The records, when cross-referenced with local gazettes of the era and fragmented personal letters from neighboring families, painted a disquieting picture of pervasive intimidation, legal manipulation, and outright coercion. The land Ravenwood now occupied, particularly the fields surrounding the decrepit cotton gin, the very ground now saturated with the curse, had been wrested from its original occupants under duress, a foundational act of violence upon which the Johnson legacy was built. Further digging into the county's archived court records, often illegible and poorly indexed, unearthed a chilling lawsuit from 1878, a legal battle that would seal the fate of generations. It detailed a contentious dispute over water rights and property access, pitting Thaddeus Johnson against a small, self-sufficient family of formerly enslaved individuals who had painstakingly built a life on a parcel of land adjacent to the burgeoning Johnson claim. The family, identified through obscure records as the Eudoras, were depicted in the prevailing racist legal language of the time as stubborn and litigious, though the subtext, once decoded, revealed them as fiercely protective of their hard-won autonomy. The outcome was swift and brutal, a predictable miscarriage of justice. The Eudoras lost their case, their claims summarily dismissed, and were subsequently forced from their ancestral homestead, leaving behind everything they had cultivated, everything they had poured their lives into. But the legal battle was only the agonizing prelude to the true horror. A tattered ledger, discovered tucked away in a forgotten mouse-eaten chest in the Johnsons' own attic, belonging to Thaddeus Johnson himself, provided the true horrifying insight into the depths of his depravity. Its entries were terse, often just dates and cryptic notes, a businessman's cold efficiency. But one series of pages dated October 1878 spoke volumes of escalating malevolence. It referenced the Eudora problem, and chillingly, the fire in the West Field, an entry scrawled with a heavy hand, almost an admission. Local fire department records from the period were non-existent, swallowed by time. But an amateur historian's meticulously kept scrapbook of local anecdotes from the turn of the century mentioned a mysterious, devastating blaze that consumed an entire farmstead belonging to a black family who had recently been evicted. No bodies were officially recovered, the account claimed, due to the intensity of the inferno, but the community, even then, had whispered of foul play, of a smoke that lingered long after the embers died. The Reign of Fire of 1975, it became chillingly clear, was not the origin of the curse, but its devastating reawakening. A cosmic mirror of a terrestrial atrocity. The legend of a celestial event, echoing in earthly horror, began to take horrifying shape. The Eudora family, dispossessed and utterly ruined, had, according to a barely coherent, almost fear-driven entry in Thaddeus Johnson's later ledger, invoked something profound and terrible in their profound desperation, a spiritual retaliation against an unspeakable wrong. He dismissed it as superstitious nonsense and witchcraft, a desperate attempt to rationalize away the supernatural. Yet his subsequent entries betrayed a growing, palpable unease. He noted strange blights on his crops that defied explanation, inexplicable illnesses among his livestock, and a pervasive, chilling silence that settled over his newly acquired fields. A silence that felt less like peace and more like a predatory weight. The pact, then, was not a deliberate agreement made by the Johnsons with some infernal entity, but a binding consequence, a primal, inescapable retribution, invoked by the wronged, a debt etched into the very fabric of the land. It was a curse born of blood and fire, forged in the ashes of the Eudora family's hopes and dreams, a monstrous demand for justice that spanned generations. The original Reign of Fire was the inferno that consumed their home, a physical manifestation of a profound, unhealing spiritual wound. The meteor shower of 1975, precisely a century later, was a cosmic echo, a malevolent signal that the forgotten debt had come due again, marking the renewed cycle of the curse with an undeniable celestial signature, a burning reminder from the heavens themselves. The hallmarks on the victims' bodies, initially a source of baffling confusion and gruesome mystery, now began to make horrific, ritualistic sense. The mutilations weren't random acts of violence, but precise, terrifying echoes of the past. One pattern, repeatedly noted by the coroner in 1975 and eerily replicated on the youngest Johnson's body, involved intricate ritualistic burns, often around the extremities, particularly the hands and feet. Thaddeus Johnson's ledger, in its later, more frantic entries, spoke of waking to the smell of burnt flesh, of finding his own animals bearing inexplicable scorch marks despite no fire, and even, disturbingly, of persistent, agonizing pains in his own limbs. The curse was consuming, literally burning the descendants, mirroring the inferno that had consumed the Eudoras. A chilling, inescapable repayment in kind. This historical excavation revealed a terrifying, unpalatable truth. The curse was not some abstract, amorphous mystical force, nor a random act of malevolence. It was a hyper-focused, acutely intelligent entity, driven by a centuries-old grievance that refused to be silenced. It was a tangible, active payment plan, meticulously designed to extract a precise pound of flesh, specifically Johnson flesh, for every injustice committed. The generational suffering, the successive deaths, were not random acts of fate, but deliberate, systematic demands for restitution. Each new victim, another installment on an eternal debt. The land itself, the very soil beneath Ravenwood, was not merely a backdrop. It was complicit, a silent witness holding the memory of the atrocity and feeding the insatiable hunger of the curse. The Johnsons were not merely victims of a curse. They were the inheritors of a terrible, undeniable bill for sins not their own, yet intrinsically tied to their bloodline. The chilling understanding settled over the hidden horror team like a shroud. This was not a ghost story in the conventional sense, but a historical haunting, an inescapable legacy of unforgiven sin woven into the very fabric of American history itself, a profound injustice refusing to lie buried. The discovery was not just of an old tragedy, but of an ongoing, active malevolence that drew its power from the very ground they walked on, from the very air they breathed, demanding its bloody, agonizing tithe, waiting for the final payment. The humid air of Ravenwood, once merely stifling, now seemed to press in with an active, malevolent weight. The arrival of the hidden horror team, with their array of infrared cameras and sophisticated audio recorders, brought a fleeting sense of professional detachment, a thin veneer of scientific inquiry over an abyss of ancestral dread. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead investigator and an esteemed folklorist, maintained his calm, analytical demeanor, but even his seasoned skepticism began to fray at the edges. The Johnson home, a sprawling antebellum structure showing its age, became their laboratory of the impossible, a focal point for a terror that defied every logical construct. Initial scans revealed nothing out of the ordinary, only the creaks of old timber and the chirping of crickets. Yet within hours, the environment began to subtly shift. Cold spots materialized without explanation, drawing sharp, sudden intakes of breath from team members who brushed through them. These pockets of frigid air, sometimes localized to a single chair or a stretch of hallway, defied the oppressive Georgian heat, serving as chilling harbingers. Mrs. Eleanor Johnson, the matriarch, spoke of them with a resigned weariness, as if they were old, unwelcome guests, intimately familiar with their glacial embrace. Her grandson, young Michael, too young to fully articulate his fear, began to refuse to enter certain rooms, clinging to his mother with an intensity that spoke volumes of an unseen presence. He would point at empty corners and whimper, speaking of shadow friends that only he could perceive. Then came the sounds, rising from the very foundations of the old home. Faint at first, like distant whispers carried on the wind through kudzu-choked fields, too indistinct to parse, too persistent to ignore. The team's sensitive microphones picked up low-frequency vibrations, rhythmic and deep, emanating from the earth beneath the house, a constant, grinding hum reminiscent of an ancient, tireless mechanism. It was a sound that resonated deeply with the brutal history of the land, evoking the ceaseless, back-breaking toil of the old cotton gin, now just a decaying skeleton outside. Sometimes, these deep thrums would crescendo into what sounded eerily like a collective moan, a guttural lament rising from the grave, only to abruptly cease, leaving an unnerving, absolute silence in their wake. The air would grow heavy, dense with an acrid, earthy scent, like disturbed soil mixed with something metallic, something long dried and ancient. The manifestations escalated with a disquieting, almost intelligent predictability. Objects began to move, not violently, not with overt force, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that stripped away any illusion of rational explanation. A heavy antique Bible on the mantel, untouched for decades, was found open to the Book of Exodus, its pages brittle and yellowed, specifically to passages describing plagues and divine retribution. A faded daguerreotype of a severe 19th-century Johnson ancestor, usually perched squarely on a side table, would be discovered askew, sometimes turned entirely to face the wall, its eyes seemingly following the family members. The Johnsons spoke of keys vanishing from hooks, only to reappear in locked drawers, or doors that, despite being bolted from the inside, would swing open onto the humid night, revealing only the desolate expanse of the cursed land. The feeling of being watched intensified, a pervasive sensation that transcended mere paranoia. It was an active, malevolent gaze. Electrical equipment brought by the team experienced intermittent failures, their screens flickering with static, their batteries draining at an alarming rate without explanation. The atmosphere within the Ravenwood home became saturated with a palpable terror, a thick, suffocating dread. The lights, already prone to flickering in the aging structure, began to strobe erratically. They spoke of vivid nightmares that left them gasping for breath, dreams of being buried alive beneath a scorching rain, or witnessing scenes of unspeakable violence enacted upon their forebears, blood staining the very soil beneath their feet. The hidden horror team, initially approaching the case with a detached academic curiosity, now found themselves profoundly unnerved, their scientific instruments capturing anomalies their training could not explain. Thermal cameras registered inexplicable cold spots with defined edges, sometimes mirroring human forms. Electromagnetic field detectors spiked wildly in otherwise inert spaces, their readings often correlating with the family's rising anxiety. One evening, as a rare summer storm brewed on the horizon, echoing the original reign of fire of decades past, the phenomenon manifested with chilling clarity, targeting the very heart of the Johnson family's ancestral trauma. The old Jinn, standing desolate and skeletal in the twilight, became an ominous focal point. What began as the familiar grinding hum within the house intensified, a mechanical groan that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air, growing into a deafening roar. Then, the distinct, rhythmic creak of wooden gears and the sickening crunch of something being processed, followed by a chorus of spectral moans and agonized screams, as if the ghosts of the enslaved laborers were reliving their torment in gruesome detail. Inside the house, in the master bedroom where the original, blood-stained land deed was kept under lock and key, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep from the walls, smelling faintly of loam and something metallic, unmistakably blood. The room temperature plummeted to an impossible degree, causing visible condensation to form on the air. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, a shadow began to coalesce in the furthest corner, elongating, twisting, taking on a vaguely human shape, but distended, almost as if it were stretched and broken, radiating despair and an ancient, insatiable vengeance. The Johnson patriarch, Elias, let out a guttural cry, pointing a trembling finger. The shadow shifted, and for a fleeting moment, a searing, bright light, like a falling star, seemed to blaze within its form, illuminating a single, spectral figure indistinct but undeniably there, its silent scream echoing the horror of its origins. It was no longer a question of whether the curse was real. It was real, it was active, and it was demanding its tribute with a terrifying, undeniable presence. The academic authority of Dr. Thorne, once a comforting anchor in the sea of the unknown, now simply provided a somber vocabulary for their shared, undeniable horror, unable to offer solace or solutions. The land remembered, and its memory was manifesting as a living, breathing nightmare, demanding repayment for a century-old debt. The living were not just haunted, they were being consumed, piece by terrifying piece, dragged into the abyss of a past that refused to stay buried. The quiet desperation of the Johnson family had become the unsettling soundtrack to our work in Ravenwood. Dr. Alistair Finch, our lead historian, spoke of the unique challenge presented by cases like this, the collision of verifiable historical fact with the amorphous terror of generational trauma. His methodical approach, usually reserved for musty archives and quiet lecture halls, now served as a bulwark against the raw, irrational fear that permeated the very air of their ancestral home. The family, weary and gaunt, offered disjointed memories, whispers passed down through terrified generations, but little in the way of concrete evidence. Their fear, however, was a currency more valuable than any document. It bespoke of a truth too terrible to articulate. Our initial dives into county records proved frustratingly sparse, a common affliction when dealing with events in the Reconstruction-era South. Land deeds from the late 1800s were often vague, transactions obscured by illiteracy, poverty, and systemic injustice. But persistence, as Dr. Finch often reminded us, was the historian's truest weapon. We eventually unearthed an obscure addendum to an old property dispute, filed in 1897, detailing a bizarre clause within a contested will. It referenced not just the seizure of land from the destitute Elias Thorne and his family by the burgeoning Johnson patriarch, but also an unsettling stipulation of perpetual bond tied to the bounty of the heavens and the fruits of the soil. It was no ordinary legal document. Its language, archaic and veiled, hinted at something far more sinister than a simple land grab. Elias Thorne, a former enslaved man who had managed to acquire a small tract of land after emancipation, had been brutally dispossessed, his family systematically eradicated. The will's clause, seemingly innocuous on the surface, laid out an agreement not merely for property transfer, but for a transference of ownership over something intangible, a future. It spoke of cycles, of tribute, of blood payment under the weeping sky. The Johnson patriarch had, it seemed, not just stolen land, but made a pact, likely with Thorne, under duress, invoking ancient, forgotten beliefs tied to the land itself. A dark irony, given Thorne's own deep connection to the earth. The rain of fire, the 1975 meteor shower, was beginning to make chilling sense. It wasn't a random cosmic event. It was the weeping sky, mentioned in Thorne's twisted legacy, the cosmic trigger for the curse to reactivate. The celestial event acted as an astrological alignment, a beacon calling forth the terms of the agreement. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal cosmological clock, resetting the debt, demanding a new payment. The mutilations on the victims, particularly the youngest Johnson, echoed obscure ritualistic patterns found in rare anthropological texts, describing desperate, binding agreements made on stolen ground, seeking to either cement ownership or invoke a terrible, lasting vengeance. Our findings had a profound effect on the Johnsons. Their patriarch, Abraham Johnson, a man whose skepticism had been his last defense, now sat a broken figure. He remembered hushed family warnings about the cycle and the sky's reckoning, dismissed as old wives' tales. Now, These fragments of oral history coalesced into a horrifying truth. His grandmother had once spoken of a specific grove near the old cotton gin, a place where the blood debt was sown. This seemingly innocuous detail, previously ignored, now screamed for investigation. The abandoned cotton gin, a skeletal monument to suffering, became our next focal point. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself. Dr. Finch, his historian's curiosity now tinged with a palpable unease, led us through the crumbling structure. Beneath rusted machinery and collapsed timbers, we discovered a hidden crawl space. It was not a natural formation, but crudely carved, almost as if to serve as a secret vault or a tomb. Inside, amidst the earth and debris, we found what appeared to be the remains of a crude altar, a flattened stone, stained dark, surrounded by what looked like petrified remnants of offerings, dried bones, fragments of iron, and clumps of matted hair, all interred with a chilling precision. The most disturbing discovery was a small, lead-encased box buried beneath the stone. Inside, a single intricately carved bone figurine, clearly human and impossibly old, lay intertwined with a rusted, tarnished silver locket. When pried open, the locket revealed two miniature, incredibly faded portraits. A stern-faced, severe-looking man we immediately recognized as the original Johnson patriarch, and a gaunt, defiant Elias Thorne, his eyes burning even in the sepia image. But it was the inscription on the back of the locket, etched with crude precision, that sent a cold dread through us. Our bond, endless cycle, blood for earth, under the fire. This was the pact. Not merely a symbolic agreement, but a physical manifestation, a conduit for the curse. The bone figurine, the specific offerings, the shared locket, these were the instruments of the stipulation of perpetual bond. The mutilations on the victims now made gruesome sense. They were not random acts of violence, but specific, ritualistic demands, fulfilling the terms of the original blood payment. The curse was not merely seeking vengeance, it was meticulously collecting a specific. The living Johnsons were not merely haunted, they were collateral, their very existence a ticking clock to the next celestial trigger, to the next horrific payment in blood. We were no longer simply investigating a family tragedy. We were observing the meticulous, terrifying mechanics of a living, breathing curse, one woven into the very fabric of the land, one that demanded an impossible price. The oppressive humidity of Ravenwood pressed down. The physical manifestation of generations of unspoken suffering, as the first faint streaks of the rain of fire began to score the inky Georgian sky, painting the kudzu-choked landscape in fleeting, unnatural hues of green and violet. Dr. Eris Thorne stood before the assembled Johnson family, his face etched with a grave solemnity. His voice, measured and deliberate, cut through the growing tension, grounding the impossible in the grim reality of historical documentation, a truth far more chilling than any supernatural fiction. For months, our team has delved into the shadowed archives of Ravenwood and beyond, Dr. Thorne began, a thick folder of yellowed documents clutched in his hands, their brittle edges hinting at the passage of over a century. Local land deeds from the Reconstruction era, church records detailing forgotten congregations, post-Civil War census data, and the chillingly sparse county sheriff reports that often tell more by what they omit than by what they record. The Johnson family curse, as it has been known, is not born of a warlock's hex or a demon's whim. It is far more ancient, far more intrinsically American, a profound terrestrial debt, consecrated in blood and betrayal, woven inextricably into the very fiber of this haunted soil. He laid out copies of the evidence on a rickety wooden table, illuminated intermittently by the shifting, incandescent light of the meteors, which cast grotesque, flickering shadows. In the brutal year of 1878, your ancestor, Josiah Johnson, a man consumed by pathological ambition and the insatiable desire for cotton profits in a recovering South, forcibly expanded his landholdings. This wasn't merely a transaction. He coveted a specific parcel, outwardly fertile and deceptively innocent. But this land was also deeply sacred to a small, resilient community of freedmen and their descendants, a community striving to build a new life after emancipation. This particular plot, known then informally as Ebenezer's Rest, had served for generations as a clandestine burial ground for their ancestors, many of whom had perished in brutal, forced labor on Johnson plantations. Josiah Johnson, driven by a perverse blend of entitlement and cruelty, with blatant disregard for human dignity and the fledgling, often unenforced laws protecting black land ownership, orchestrated a brutal massacre. He did not merely displace them, he murdered the small, courageous family who tended those graves, desecrating the very ground their loved ones occupied. He then, with a defiant act of malice, built his new profit-churning cotton gin directly atop those hallowed burials, effectively grinding their memories and their being into the unforgiving earth. The Johnsons, pale and wide-eyed, absorbed the crushing, undeniable weight of this unspeakable legacy. The air grew perceptibly colder, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. A distinct cloying scent of damp earth and decay began to permeate the air around the ancient gin, growing stronger, turning their stomachs. A low, almost imperceptible hum started to emanate from beneath their feet, a vibration resonating deep in their bones, a precursor to something terrible. The pact wasn't a spoken oath or an arcane incantation, Dr. Thorne continued, his gaze unwavering, taking in their terrified, desperate faces. It was the horrific act itself, the violent, unholy claim of sacred land, the unpunished murder of innocent souls whose final resting place was obliterated for profit. The Reign of Fire of 1975 and this current celestial echo are not the cause of the curse. They are merely cosmic amplifiers, periods of heightened energetic resonance, allowing the dormant, furious, and deeply wounded energy of those wronged souls to manifest with chilling precision. The land remembers every drop of blood spilled. The forgotten dead demand payment not in gold, but in blood, a terrifying mirroring of the violence inflicted upon them so long ago, a perpetual cycle of anguish. He gestured towards the skeletal remains of the cotton gin, its rusted machinery now appearing like a monstrous petrified spider in the eerie meteor light. The deaths you have experienced, generation after generation, have always mirrored the original transgression in chilling symmetry, a violent rending, a mutilation that speaks to the desecration of the body and the earth itself. The youngest victims, the most vulnerable, representing the innocence extinguished by Josiah Johnson's rapacious greed. The curse, therefore, is not a random act of evil. It is a recursive echo, a malevolent feedback loop, demanding its pound of flesh from each successive generation of Johnsons, binding the living to a historical atrocity they did not commit, but for which they now bear the profound burden of generational atonement. So, what do? How do we stop this from consuming us all? Silas Johnson, the eldest surviving member, whispered, his voice hoarse with a fear that transcended personal dread, born of profound, generational grief and the heavy weight of complicity. His hands trembled uncontrollably from the invisible, crushing pressure, tightening their chests. "We offer a different kind of payment," Dr. Thorne responded, his voice gaining a quiet, spiritual authority. a beacon in the terrifying dark. Not blood, but truth, acknowledgement, and restitution. Not to the living, for those wronged are long gone, their physical forms return to dust, but to the land itself, to the enduring spirits of the ancestors disturbed and desecrated. We must perform an act of symbolic redress, a final confrontation, not with a demon or a spectral entity, but with the very conscience of this cursed earth, a history demanding to be seen, acknowledged, and perhaps finally healed. Outside, the meteor shower reached its terrifying crescendo, each streaking light seeming to scream across the heavens, leaving behind trails of unholy fire. The wind whipped up into a frenzied vortex, carrying not only the cloying scent of decay, but a faint, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from directly beneath the very ground, chilling them to the bone. Shadows danced wildly, taking on fleeting, human-like forms at the periphery of their vision. Shapes that seemed to twist and writhe in silent agony, pulling at their minds. The old cotton gin shuddered violently, a low, metallic groan echoing from within its rusted maw, sounding less like failing machinery and more like a dying, tortured breath of something immense. Our exhaustive research unearthed Josiah Johnson's original land deed, signed just days after the massacre. Dr. Thorne explained, holding up a brittle, framed document, its ink faded but legible. A chilling testament to his conquest and the foundational violence upon which this entire property was built. More importantly, we also located fragmented but definitive records of the family buried beneath this gin. Their names, though systematically erased from most official county records, were miraculously preserved in a fragile, hand-stitched community ledger found hidden within an old church Bible belonging to that freedmen's community. The Patterson family, Elias, his wife Sarah, and their 2 young children, Samuel and Lily. Their names must be spoken aloud. Their horrific fate must be acknowledged. Their memory must be honored, truly honored, not merely buried. He then revealed a painstakingly hand-drawn map, meticulously overlaid with old survey lines and spectral energy points. Our aim is to return the symbolic ownership of this specific, desecrated plot of land to its rightful, though spiritual, inheritors. We will bury this original, unholy deed deep at the lowest point beneath the gin's foundation, at the very heart of the desecration. Alongside it, we will place a specially commissioned memorial stone, etched with the names of the Patterson family, a tangible sign of recognition. It is an act of profound historical correction, a desperate plea for peace to the wronged. It is our only chance to sever this binding, to at last offer a different kind of justice, one born of truth and atonement. The Johnsons exchanged looks of desperate collective resolve. This wasn't some theatrical, arcane ritual of the occult, but a profound act of historical reckoning, a painful embrace of a truth they had denied for generations. They carried the weight of it now. The air thickened further, becoming almost liquid, heavy and suffocating. But chilling, immense pressure built in their chests, a sensation of countless unseen eyes watching, waiting, judging their every move, their every hesitant breath. The groan from the gin intensified, sounding like the earth itself was weeping in agony, the very ground protesting. As they began to move slowly, deliberately, towards the imposing, shadow-laden structure of the gin, a palpable sense of dread clung to them, a second skin. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with a terrible, vibrant, almost sentient energy, pulling them forward. The meteors now fell like furious, burning tears from the cosmic void, illuminating the path with an otherworldly, pulsating light that flickered between menace and revelation, guiding them to their fate. The long-suffering land, so long ignored, so long bleeding from its historical wounds, was finally about to receive its due. The confrontation was not with a tangible monster of myth, but with the raw, bleeding wound of American history itself, and the terrible, inexorable price of forgotten justice. The humid Georgia air, once a suffocating blanket of dread for the Johnsons, now carried a different kind of silence. The desperate final acts within their ancestral home, meticulously documented by our team, had culminated not in a triumph of good over evil, but in a fragile, unsettling truce. The true nature of the 19th century pact, the unholy covenant woven into the very earth of Ravenwood, was laid bare. It was not merely a debt owed for stolen land and murdered souls, but a perpetual lease on life, paid in blood, designed to ensure the prosperity of the usurpers at an unspeakable cost to their own descendants. Our cameras captured the harrowing moments as the Johnsons, armed with ancestral knowledge unearthed from forgotten journals and whispered family legends, attempted to sever the grotesque umbilical cord between their lineage and the insatiable entity born of that initial transgression. They sought not to destroy, but to appease, to divert the current, to placate the aggrieved spirits whose cries had fueled the curse for generations. The Rain of Fire, the celestial phenomenon that had first marked Ravenwood in 1975, had returned, not as an omen of destruction from above, but as a cosmic echo, a signal for the terrestrial horror to feed once more. The youngest of the surviving Johnsons, Alara, became the unwitting conduit. It was through her harrowing, near-fatal confrontation with the lingering presence of the original wronged souls that the true mechanism of the curse was revealed. The entity, a composite of ancient pain and profound injustice, demanded not just lives, but recognition, an acknowledgement of the brutal history buried beneath the kudzu-choked fields. The pact was a twisted form of sustained remembrance, each death a fresh inscription in blood, ensuring the story of the past would never truly fade. In a sequence of events we are still processing, a ritual of restitution was performed, not through arcane magic, but through a profound, gut-wrenching act of public confession and ancestral atonement. The surviving Johnsons, led by the stoic matriarch Beatrice, stood on the very ground where the original atrocities occurred, openly acknowledging the sins of their forebears. They dedicated a portion of the land, that which had been most fiercely contested, back to the memory of those dispossessed and murdered, establishing it as a perpetual, sacred trust. It was a desperate gamble, an offering of truth and humility in the face of an entity that thrived on concealment and terror. The immediate aftermath was eerily quiet. The suffocating presence that had clung to the Johnson homestead like a shroud began to recede. The unsettling whispers in the walls ceased. The inexplicable drafts, the chilling drops in temperature, the pervasive sense of being watched, all dissipated, leaving behind only the natural sounds of rural Georgia, the distant buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves, the mournful cry of a lone owl. But peace for the Johnsons remains a relative term. The cycle of unexplained deaths, which had haunted their family for nearly a century, did indeed halt. No further bodies bearing the grotesque hallmarks of the Rain of Fire victims have been discovered. Yet the cost was immense. The family, already fractured by generations of silent suffering and paranoia, was irrevocably scarred. Alara, though physically recovered, bears the invisible wounds of her ordeal, forever altered by her brief communion with the vengeful dead. Beatrice, the anchor of the family, aged visibly, her spirit burdened by the weight of a truth too terrible to bear, yet too vital to ignore. The Ravenwood property itself has undergone a profound transformation. The old cotton gin, once a symbol of the land's dark history, now stands as a stark, skeletal memorial, intentionally left to decay as a silent testament to the past. The once manicured fields are slowly reclaiming their wild state, the kudzu no longer a symbol of neglect, but of nature's slow, inexorable reassertion. The Johnson family, though still residing on a portion of the original acreage, lives with an understanding that their tenure is not one of ownership, but of guardianship. They are custodians of a memory, forever tied to the land's grim legacy. Our investigation into the Johnsons of Ravenwood stands as one of the most compelling and disturbing cases the hidden horror has ever undertaken. It is a stark reminder that history is not merely a collection of dates and names, but a living, breathing force, capable of exacting payment across generations. It suggests that some debts incurred by ancestral transgressions cannot simply be forgotten or outrun. They must be acknowledged, atoned for, and often appeased. The Johnsons' ordeal forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the American landscape, its contested histories, and the lingering echoes of violence that permeate the very ground beneath our feet. It challenges our understanding of justice, suggesting that perhaps, in certain forgotten corners of our world, the laws of man give way to older, darker covenants, where the dead hold sway and the living are merely pawns in a generational struggle for redemption or damnation. The cessation of the deaths offers a glimmer of hope, a testament to the possibility that even the most deeply ingrained curses might be mitigated, if not entirely broken, through radical acts of truth and reconciliation. But the shadow of Ravenwood remains. We as investigators are left to ponder. Was it the restitution that brought about this fragile peace, or merely a temporary appeasement, buying the Johnsons a reprieve until the next rain of fire inevitably marks the sky? The Johnsons continue their silent vigil, forever aware of the potential for the curse to reawaken, to demand its next payment. Their story, laid bare here, is a profound call to reflection. We invite you, our audience, to delve deeper into the historical records of similar American land disputes, to examine the unsettling connections between ancestral injustice and generational suffering. Share your own insights, your theories, your experiences with places where the past refuses to die. The discussion surrounding the Johnsons of Ravenwood and the chilling implications of their documented reality is far from over. Visit the Hidden Horror website for further case files, archival documents, and ongoing analysis of this terrifying saga. The conversation continues, for some truths, once unearthed, can never be reburied, and some debts, though paid in blood, may never truly be settled.